Imagine standing on top of a volcano so remote that fewer people have climbed it than have summited Everest. Now imagine breaking through the final wall of clouds, your lungs burning, your body screaming for rest, and suddenly witnessing something so surreal, so profoundly beautiful, that every ounce of suffering instantly dissolves into awe. 7,000 emperor penguins, gathered like a living river of black and white along a volcanic shoreline where fire literally meets ice, and you're the first human eyes to see this sight in over 2 decades. This is not fiction. This happened. And the story behind it will change how you see courage, humility, and the raw power of nature forever. Before we climb into this incredible journey, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Because after this story, you'll never look at the edge of the world the same way again. High above the Southern Ocean, in one of the most isolated and hostile environments on planet Earth, lies Heard Island, a place so remote that it sits nearly 2,000 miles from any inhabited continent, battered by relentless storms, encased in glaciers, and crowned by an active volcano called Mawson Peak, the highest point of any Australian external territory. For decades, this peak stood unconquered, not because climbers lacked the skill, but because reaching it required navigating a perfect storm of logistical nightmares, political red tape, environmental restrictions, and weather so violent it could turn deadly in minutes. The mountain didn't just challenge your body, it tested your soul, your patience, your worthiness to stand in one of Earth's last truly wild places. And in late 2024, a small team of Australian climbers decided they were ready to answer that call, unaware that what awaited them at the summit would be far more than just a geographic achievement. It would be a revelation, a humbling encounter with life thriving against all odds, and a mirror reflecting back the very essence of why we climb, why we explore, and why some places demand not conquest, but reverence. The team was led by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a 47-year-old glaciologist and mountaineer whose credentials read like an adventure novel, someone who had spent 20 years studying the cryosphere, the frozen parts of our planet, not from the comfort of university labs, but from the brutal front lines of climate research in Antarctica, Greenland, and the high Himalayas. Sarah wasn't your typical adrenaline junkie climber chasing Instagram summits and sponsored gear deals. She was a scientist first, someone who understood ice not as an obstacle but as a living, breathing archive of Earth's history. And she approached mountains with a quiet reverence that bordered on spiritual. Her team knew her as someone who would spend an hour photographing a single ice formation, marveling at the way ancient air bubbles told stories of atmospheric conditions from millennia past. She rarely spoke about her achievements, despite having summited 6 of the 7 summits and published groundbreaking research on glacial retreat. Her humility was legendary, often deflecting credit to her team, to the mountain itself, to the privilege of simply being allowed into these sacred spaces. But beneath that gentle exterior was a core of absolute steel, forged through years of surviving in places where one mistake meant death, where nature didn't care about your PhD or your climbing resume. Sarah had assembled a team of 5 other climbers, each bringing specialized skills, but also sharing her philosophy that mountains were not enemies to be conquered, but teachers to learn from. There was Marcus Chen, a paramedic and ice climbing specialist who had pulled people back from the edge of hypothermia more times than he could count. Someone whose calm under pressure was almost supernatural. Jessica Thornton, a wildlife biologist who had spent 3 seasons studying penguin colonies in the Antarctic Peninsula. Her passion for these creatures evident in every conversation, often saying that penguins were the true mountaineers of the bird world, thriving where most life gave up. David O'Connor, a photographer and filmmaker whose work had captured some of the most remote expeditions on Earth, but who insisted he was just a storyteller trying to show people why these places mattered. Elena Vasquez, a logistics coordinator and former naval officer who understood the Southern Ocean. Like few others, having survived 2 ship evacuations in her career, bringing a no-nonsense pragmatism that balanced Sarah's scientific wonder. And finally, Thomas Wright, the youngest at 32, a climbing guide from Tasmania who had grown up staring at maps of Heard Island, dreaming of the day he might set foot on its black volcanic beaches, someone who represented the next generation of explorers, who understood that true adventure meant leaving places better than you found them. And their journey had begun not with excitement, but with bureaucracy. The kind of soul-crushing process that had defeated previous expeditions before they even left harbor. Heard Island is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected under some of the strictest environmental regulations on the planet, and rightfully so because it represents one of the few places where human impact has been minimal, where ecosystems function as they have for thousands of years. Getting permission required 3 years of proposals, environmental impact assessments, proving their team's credentials, demonstrating their waste management plans, showing they understood the fragility of what they were entering. Sarah had written and rewritten applications, attended video conferences at 3 in the morning to accommodate time zones, faced skeptical government panels who questioned why anyone needed to climb this mountain at all when satellite imagery could provide data. She had faced criticism from within the Ike climbing community too, voices saying she was being too cautious, too deferential to bureaucrats, that mountains belong to those brave enough to climb them. But Sarah held firm, because she understood something that would later prove prophetic. Some places don't grant access, they grant permission to witness, and only to those who approach with proper humility. The financial and logistical challenges were equally brutal. Heard Island sits in the furious 50s, that band of latitude where the Southern Ocean circles Antarctica unimpeded by land, building swells that can reach 70 feet, generating winds that scream at over 100 miles per hour. Getting there required chartering a vessel capable of handling those seas, with ice-strengthened hulls and experienced polar captains, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The weather windows were measured not in weeks but in hours, sometimes minutes, where conditions might allow a landing before the next system rolled through. Previous expeditions had reached the island only to sit offshore for weeks, unable to land safely, eventually forced to retreat with their goal visible but untouchable. Sarah's team had spent 2 years securing funding through universities, environmental organizations, and private donors who believed in the scientific and educational value of their mission, each pitch meeting a test of her ability to articulate why this mattered beyond personal achievement. She spoke not of conquering a peak but of documenting how this isolated ecosystem was responding to global climate change, of establishing baseline data for future research, of sharing a story that might inspire protection for places most people would never see. When they finally departed from Hobart in November, aboard a modified research vessel called the Southern Cross, the mood was electric but tempered with realism. Everyone knew the statistics, how few expeditions had successfully summited Mawson Peak, how the mountain had a way of defending itself through weather that could shift from clear skies to complete whiteout in less than an hour. The voyage took 12 days. 12 days of massive rolling swells that had even experienced sailors turning green, of watching albatrosses glide alongside the ship with wingspans that seemed impossible, of crossing that invisible line where the water turns from blue to a deep gunmetal gray, and you know you've entered the Southern Ocean proper. Sarah spent those days reviewing maps and satellite data, but also in quiet reflection, journaling about what it meant to approach a place with such extreme respect for its power. She wrote one evening, visible later in David's documentary footage, "We are not going to take this mountain. If we summit, it will be because Heard Island allowed us. Because we listened carefully enough, moved humbly enough, respected deeply enough. The mountain owes us nothing. We owe it everything." The first sight of Heard Island emerged from morning mist like a vision from another world. A massive volcanic cone rising directly from the sea, glaciers spilling down its flanks like frozen waterfalls, the summit wreathed in clouds that seemed to boil and churn with their own weather system. The beaches were black volcanic sand, and even from the ship they could see the white dots of penguin colonies scattered along the coast, thousands upon thousands of birds that had chosen this harsh environment as home. The island felt primordial, like something from Earth's early history. And as they prepared for their first landing attempt, there was a palpable sense that they were about to step not just onto remote land, but into a different relationship with wildness itself. Elena had charted 3 possible landing sites depending on swell direction, and after watching the ocean for 6 hours, they made their approach to Atlas Cove. The ship's crew expertly navigating through kelp beds and glacial ice fragments. The Zodiac. Boats loaded with their equipment and sealed containers designed to ensure they would leave no trace of their presence. Stepping onto Heard Island was like stepping onto another planet. The ground crunched with volcanic ash mixed with ice crystals. The air smelled of sulfur and ocean brine, and the sound was overwhelming. A cacophony of wind, crashing waves, and the guttural calls of tens of thousands of penguins who regarded these strange bipedal visitors with a mixture of curiosity and complete indifference. Jessica immediately fell into researcher mode, tears streaming down her face as she documented species she'd only seen in journals, including a massive colony of king penguins that shouldn't even be on Heard Island, according to historical records, evidence of how changing ocean temperatures were shifting ranges. The team established their base camp with meticulous care. Every tent stake anchored in approved locations. Every waste system triple-checked. Their footprints consciously minimized. Sarah gathered everyone that first evening as the sun barely dipped below the horizon, the Antarctic summer providing nearly 24 hours of daylight, and reminded them, "We are guests here. Grateful, humble guests. The penguins were here first, the seals were here first, the island was here first. We climb with permission, not with entitlement." But if Sarah and her team approached Heard Island with reverence and humility, not everyone shared that philosophy, and this is where the story takes its first dark turn, where human ego and nature's indifference collide in ways that would test everything this expedition stood for. On their second day, as they were conducting glacier assessments and planning their summit route, a radio transmission crackled through from the Southern Cross with news that sent shockwaves through the camp. Another vessel had appeared on radar, approaching Heard Island from the north, and according to maritime identification, it was the Aurora's Challenge, a luxury expedition yacht carrying a group of wealthy adventure tourists and their guide, a man named Brett Cunningham, someone whose reputation in the mountaineering world was equal parts impressive and infamous. Brett was a 45-year-old American climber who had indeed summited the 7 summits, who ran a high-end guiding company called Summit Elite that charged 6-figure fees to take rich clients up famous peaks, and whose social media presence was a carefully curated display of dramatic summit photos, inspirational quotes about conquering nature, and partnerships with outdoor brands that valued image over ethics. He was exactly the kind of climber who represented everything Sarah stood against, someone who saw mountains as trophies to collect, who measured success in summits reached rather than ecosystems respected, whose clients were often woefully unprepared, but wealthy enough to buy their way onto serious expeditions. The radio transmission continued with more disturbing news. Brett's team had apparently obtained some form of expedited permit through political connections and corporate sponsorships, bypassing much of the environmental review that Sarah's team had endured, and they were planning to summit Mawson Peak within 48 hours of arrival, what Brett was already promoting on social media as the ultimate first ascent rush for his premium clients. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She knew Brett by reputation, had seen his posts that treated nature like a theme park, had heard stories from other climbers about his willingness to push clients beyond safe limits for the sake of summit photos. More concerning was that his team included a television crew from a reality adventure show, meaning their presence would be about spectacle rather than science, about drama rather than documentation. Elena pulled up Brett's public Instagram feed on the ship's satellite internet, and there it was. Posts from just hours ago, showing him and 3 clients posing on the Aurora's Challenge deck with Heard Island in the background. Captions like, "When you've climbed everywhere else, you go where no rich person has gone before," and "Mawson Peak about to get conquered by the best team money can assemble. Stay tuned for summit content that will break the internet." Marcus actually laughed in disbelief, a bitter sound. "He's treating this like Disneyland. Does he have any idea what this place is? What it means?" Thomas was less diplomatic. "He's going to get someone killed, or worse, he's going to damage an ecosystem that's been pristine for thousands of years because he wants Instagram likes." Sarah remained quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountain, at the penguin colonies that had no idea they were about to become backdrop props for someone's ego. When she finally spoke, her voice carried that combination of sadness and determination that her team had learned to recognize. "We can't control what Brett does. We can only control how we respond, how we climb, how we honor this place. Let's focus on our work, on doing this right. The mountain will judge us all equally." But there was tension now, an edge to their preparations, because they knew that Brett's arrival and his approach represented a fundamental clash of values, and on a mountain as unforgiving as Mawson Peak, values weren't abstract philosophy. They could mean the difference between life and death. Brett Cunningham's arrival at Heard Island the next day was exactly as flamboyant and problematic as feared. The Aurora's Challenge, a sleek 90-foot yacht that looked more suited for Caribbean cruising than polar exploration, anchored in Winston Lagoon, and within an hour Brett's team had made a landing that violated at least a dozen environmental protocols that Sarah's team had strictly followed, using motorized vehicles on the beach to transport gear, setting up a sprawling base camp directly adjacent to a seal breeding area, and immediately beginning drone flights over penguin colonies to capture what Brett called establishing shots for the documentary. The television crew, 3 people from an adventure reality network, were filming everything with a breathless narration style that made it sound like they were about to storm the beaches of Normandy rather than conduct a mountaineering expedition. Brett himself was exactly as his photo suggested, tall and athletic with the kind of effortless confidence that came from years of being told you're exceptional. wearing the latest technical gear with every sponsor logo visible, moving with the swagger of someone who had never truly failed at anything because money and connections had always smoothed the rough edges. Sarah's first direct encounter with Brett happened that afternoon when he hiked over to their camp, television crew in tow, with what he probably thought was a friendly gesture but came across as territorial posturing. Dr. Mitchell, right? Sarah? Brett Cunningham, Summit Elite Expeditions. Heard you guys have been here a few days already. That's awesome, really thorough preparation. Very academic. There was a condescension in his tone that was barely veiled, an implication that their careful approach was somehow less legitimate than his aggressive timeline. Sarah extended her hand with professional courtesy. Welcome to Heard Island, Brett. Yes, we're conducting glaciological surveys and preparing for a summit attempt that respects both the environment and the weather windows. How is your team acclimating? Brett laughed, that confident chuckle of someone who thought caution was for lesser climbers. Acclimating? Sarah, my clients have summited all over the world. We're not here to study ice crystals. We're here to put boots on the summit and show people what's possible when you commit fully. We're going up tomorrow, actually. Weather window looks perfect for the next 36 hours. You guys, planning to join us? Could make it a joint expedition. Would be great footage. The offer was transparently strategic, trying to piggyback on Sarah's legitimate scientific credentials while pushing a timeline that any experienced polar climber would recognize as rushed and dangerous. Marcus, standing beside Sarah, couldn't contain himself. Tomorrow? You just arrived. You haven't assessed conditions, haven't done proper weather forecasting beyond a surface report. Mawson Peak generates its own weather systems. What looks perfect can turn lethal in under an hour. Brett's expression shifted, a flash of irritation crossing his features. With all due respect, and I mean this professionally, I've guided more mountains than most people visit in a lifetime. I know how to read weather, how to manage risk. My clients are paying premium prices for premium results. Sometimes the academic approach is too conservative for actual mountaineering. The insult was clear. The implication that Sarah's caution was somehow cowardice, that real climbers like Brett understood things that scientists and academics couldn't grasp. Jessica stepped forward, her voice tight with controlled anger. This isn't about academic versus athletic approaches. This is about respecting an ecosystem that's functioned without human interference and understanding that on Heard Island, the margin for error is zero. You're not on Kilimanjaro with rescue helicopters an hour away. If something goes wrong here, people die and penguins suffer because of our arrogance. Brett's response was to smile patronizingly at Jessica as if she were a child who didn't understand adult conversation. Penguins are resilient creatures. They've survived here for thousands of years. A few humans climbing nearby isn't going to hurt them. Look, I get it. You're scientists. You have to be extra careful because of funding and universities and all that red tape. We're professionals operating under different parameters. No disrespect to your approach, but Summit Elite delivers results. Tomorrow we summit, we get the footage, we show the world what Heard Island looks like from the top, and then we're out of your way. Simple, clean, professional. The television producer chimed in then, a woman named Kendall who looked at the landscape the way someone might evaluate a film set. This is going to be incredible content, honestly. The first reality show crew to document a Heard Island summit? The ratings will be massive. And think about the awareness this will bring to the island, Dr. Mitchell. More people learning about this place because of our show than would ever read a scientific journal. We're actually helping your cause. The disconnect was stunning. The complete inability to understand that awareness without respect was worse than ignorance, that treating sacred ground as a content farm was exactly the attitude that endangered these places. Sarah could feel her team's frustration building, could sense that this conversation was about to escalate into an argument that would serve no one. So she employed the strategy that had served her through 2 decades of dealing with difficult personalities in extreme environments. She chose patience over confrontation, wisdom over winning the argument. Brett, Kendall, I appreciate you stopping by. Every team has their own approach, and I respect your experience. What I would ask is that you consider the environmental guidelines we received, particularly regarding drone usage over wildlife and campsite locations near breeding areas. These aren't arbitrary rules. They're based on research about stress impacts on colonies. Beyond that, I truly hope your summit attempt is safe and successful. The mountain will make the final decision about timing. Her words were gracious but carried an undertone that anyone paying attention would catch. The mountain itself would be the judge of whose approach was valid. Brett clearly caught it, and, for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Maybe recognition that Sarah wasn't intimidated by his reputation, maybe irritation that she wouldn't engage in the dominance game he was used to winning. He nodded curtly. Sure, we'll be respectful. Good luck with your research. Maybe we'll see you on the summit, if you make it up there eventually. As Brett's group walked back toward their camp, his voice carried on the wind, clearly intended to be overheard. Academic climbers, man. More interested in penguin feelings than actual mountaineering. This is why real first ascents are made by professionals, not researchers. The television crew laughed, and Thomas had to be physically held back by Marcus from following them to continue the argument. Sarah gathered her team in their mess tent, and what she said next revealed the depth of her understanding about what they were really facing. This isn't about Brett's ego or our ego. This is about two completely different relationships. With wildness, he sees nature as something to overcome, to use, to extract value from. We see it as something to learn from, to be humbled by, to participate in with gratitude. Both approaches will be tested on this mountain, and the mountain doesn't care about resumes or sponsorship deals or reality shows. It cares about respect, preparation, and humility. We continue our plan. We do this right, even if it takes longer, especially if it takes longer, because the summit isn't the point. How we get there is the point. But doing it right meant watching Brett's team prepare for an attempt that violated everything Sarah's philosophy stood for. And over the next 24 hours, the contrast between the two expeditions became almost painfully stark. Brett's clients, 3 people who had paid over $200,000 each for this experience, were clearly talented athletes and experienced high-altitude climbers, but their preparation for Heard Island specifically was minimal. There was Richard Blackwell, a hedge fund CEO in his early 50s, who collected summit photos the way some people collected art, his home office apparently a gallery of himself on famous peaks with motivational captions. Patricia Montgomery, a 48-year-old tech entrepreneur who had famously climbed Everest on her 3rd attempt and wrote a best-selling book about perseverance that was heavy on personal triumph language and light on acknowledgement of the Sherpa team that had literally carried her gear. And James Chen, no relation to Marcus, a 39-year-old social media influencer whose following was built on extreme sports content and whose every moment was documented for his millions of followers, with commentary that treated nature as an obstacle course designed for human entertainment. These were not bad people, but they were people whose wealth and success had insulated them from the kind of failure that teaches humility, who were used to getting what they paid for, who approached this expedition as consumers of an experience rather than participants in something larger than themselves. Their preparation was all speed and confidence, loading technical climbing gear with efficiency, but without the careful systems checks that polar environments demanded, consulting weather forecasts but not correlating them with the specific microclimate data that Sarah's team had been gathering for days, discussing route options but dismissing the slower, safer approaches. Because they wanted dramatic footage of steep ice climbing. Brett ran the operation with professional competence but also with visible impatience whenever his clients asked questions that slowed the timeline. His body language communicating that questions were obstacles rather than signs of healthy caution. The television crew was everywhere, staging shots that required climbers to repeat actions for better camera angles, positioning themselves in ways that disturbed wildlife for the sake of compelling backgrounds, treating the expedition as a production rather than an exploration. Kendall, the producer, could be heard coaching dramatic reactions. Richard, when you look at the mountain, I need more awe, more hunger in your eyes. Patricia, talk about how this represents conquering your fears. James, get some selfie content with the penguins, but make it look spontaneous. Sarah's team, by contrast, spent those same hours in meticulous preparation that probably looked boring to any outside observer but represented the difference between survival and catastrophe in polar environments. They calibrated GPS units, triple-checked communication systems, established cache points along their planned route with supplies that would be needed for retreat if weather turned. Practiced crevasse rescue scenarios until every movement was muscle memory, reviewed medical protocols for the specific challenges of high-altitude hypothermia in wet coastal conditions, and most importantly, they